Robert Harrison stood by the huge window of his Montana ranch house, watching his biggest nightmare unfold right before his eyes. The black stallion was at it again. Thunder, as the ranch hands called him, was tearing through the wooden fence like it was made of paper. Robert's jaw tightened as he watched thousands of dollars worth of fence posts scatter across the ground. This wasn't just any horse. This was a force of nature wrapped in black fur and muscle. Thunder stood nearly 17, hands tall, with eyes that burned like fire and a spirit that refused to be broken. The horse had come with the ranch when Robert bought it 6 months ago, and he was beginning to think it was the worst investment of his life. Robert had made his fortune in the technology world. He started with nothing but a laptop and a dream in his garage 20 years ago. Now his software company was worth over $200 million. He thought buying a ranch would be easy. After all, how hard could it be? You buy some land, get some cattle, hire some workers, and watch the money roll in. Boy, was he wrong. The problem started on day one. Thunder had been living wild on the ranch for years before Robert bought it. The previous owner, an old rancher named Tom, had warned him about the horse. But Robert thought he was just trying to lower the selling price. Tom had looked him dead in the eye and said, "That horse will cost you more money than you can imagine. He's not just wild, he's smart." Wild, that's the dangerous kind. Robert had laughed it off. He was a successful businessman. He could handle one horse. How wrong he was. In the first month, Thunder had broken through 5 different fences. Each repair cost Robert about $8,000. The horse seemed to know exactly where to hit to cause the most damage. He would rear up on his back legs and crash down on the fence posts with the force of a sledgehammer. The sound would echo across the valley like gunshots, but the fence damage was just the beginning. Thunder had also figured out how to open gates. Not just push them open, but actually work the latches with his teeth and hooves. Robert had watched security camera footage of the horse opening 3 different gates in one night, letting out over 50 head of cattle. It took the ranch hands 2 full days to round them all up again. The cattle were terrified of Thunder. Whenever he appeared, they would scatter in all directions like leaves in a windstorm. This made it impossible to move them where they needed to go. The ranch hands had to work around Thunder's schedule, waiting for him to be on the other side of the property before they could do anything with the herd. 2 ranch hands had already quit because of Thunder. The first one, a guy named Pete who had worked with horses for 15 years, lasted exactly 1 week. He said Thunder was unlike any horse he had ever seen. "That animal has the devil in him," Pete had told Robert before packing his bags. "I've worked with wild Mustangs, Broncos, and stallions that would kick your head clean off. But this one is different. He thinks before he acts. That's what makes him so dangerous." The second ranch hand to quit was a woman named Lisa. She had been working with difficult horses her whole life. Her grandfather had been a horse trainer, and she learned everything from him. But after Thunder cornered her in the barn for 20 minutes, keeping her trapped while he destroyed feed bags and equipment, she decided she had enough. "I'm not getting paid enough to risk my life," she told Robert. "That horse is going to seriously hurt someone, and I don't want it to be me." Robert had tried everything he could think of. He hired the best horse trainers in Montana. The first trainer, a man who claimed he could gentle any horse in 2 weeks, lasted exactly 3 days. Thunder had thrown him over a fence and into a water trough. The trainer left with a broken wrist and a bruised ego. The second trainer was a woman who specialized in wild horses. She used gentling techniques that were supposed to work on any animal. Thunder pretended to cooperate for 2 days, then kicked a hole in the side of her truck when she wasn't looking. She left that same afternoon. The third trainer was an old cowboy who said he had never met a horse he couldn't break. Thunder proved him wrong in spectacular fashion. The horse had somehow figured out how to open the trainer's toolbox and scattered expensive equipment all over the pasture. Some of the tools were never found. Robert had spent over $60,000 on trainers alone. That didn't include the fence repairs, the cattle roundups, the equipment damage, and the overtime pay for ranch hands who had to work extra hours because of Thunder's destruction. The insurance company was threatening to drop Robert's coverage. They had already raised his rates twice because of Thunder-related incidents. The insurance agent had visited the ranch last week and watched Thunder in action. He left shaking his head and muttering about acts of God and horses from hell. Local veterinarians refused to come to the ranch anymore. The last vet to visit had to climb onto the roof of his truck to escape Thunder. The horse had trapped him there for 2 hours, occasionally bumping the truck hard enough to make it rock back and forth. The vet finally had to call for help to create a distraction so he could get down and reach his vehicle. Robert's wife had stopped visiting the ranch altogether. She said the place gave her nightmares. His business partners were starting to question his judgment. How could a man who built a successful technology company be defeated by one horse? The worst part was that Robert could see the intelligence in Thunder's eyes. This wasn't just a wild animal acting on instinct. The horse was planning his actions. He would study the ranch hand's routines and then strike when they least expected it. He seemed to take pleasure in causing chaos and confusion. Thunder had cost Robert over $150,000 in just 6 months. At this rate, the horse would bankrupt the ranch operation within a year. Robert's accountant had already suggested selling the property and cutting their losses. But Robert's pride wouldn't let him give up. He hadn't become successful by running away from problems. Standing at that window, watching Thunder destroy another section of fence, Robert made a decision. He would try one more time to find someone who could handle this horse. But this time, he wouldn't hire some fancy trainer with certificates and awards. He needed someone different. Someone who understood that Thunder wasn't just any horse. He had heard rumors about a cowboy down in Texas who had a gift with difficult horses. The man's name was Jake, and people said he could gentle horses that others had given up on. Robert had his assistant make some phone calls to find this mysterious cowboy. The ranch foreman, an old-timer named Bill, walked into the room as Robert was making his decision. Bill had been working ranches for 40 years and had seen everything. Even he was stumped by Thunder. "Boss," Bill said, taking off his hat and scratching his gray hair, "I hate to say this, but maybe it's time to consider other options. That horse is going to hurt someone bad if we don't do something soon." Robert turned from the window and looked at Bill. "What kind of other options?" Bill hesitated. He knew Robert wouldn't like what he was about to say. "Well, there are places that take problem horses. Places where he can't hurt anyone or cause damage." Robert knew what Bill meant, but he wasn't ready to give up yet. Not when he was so close to finding this cowboy from Texas. "Give me 1 more week, Bill. If this Jake fellow can't help us, then we'll talk about other options." As if he could hear their conversation, Thunder let out a loud whinny from the pasture and kicked over a water trough. The sound of metal hitting the ground echoed across the ranch like a challenge. The battle between the Millionaire and the wild horse was far from over. Jake Wilson had been driving for 15 straight hours when he finally saw the sign for Harrison Ranch. His old pickup truck wheezed and coughed as it climbed the winding mountain road. The truck was older than some of the horses he had trained, but it had never let him down. Just like Jake himself, it might not look like much, but it got the job done. The phone call had come 3 days ago. Robert Harrison, some rich guy from the tech world, had bought a ranch in Montana and was having trouble with a horse. Jake almost didn't take the call. He had heard this story before. Rich city folks buy ranches thinking it's going to be like something they saw in a movie. Then reality hits them hard, but something in Robert's voice was different. This wasn't just some guy complaining about a stubborn horse. Robert sounded desperate, like a man who had tried everything and was running out of options. Jake had always been a sucker for lost causes. Jake came from a long line of cowboys. His grandfather had worked cattle drives back when that was still a real job. His father had been a rodeo champion before settling down to train horses. Jake had grown up in a world where horses were more than just animals. They were partners, friends, and sometimes the difference between life and death. The Wilson family ranch in Texas had been in the family for 4 generations. But times were tough. Cattle prices were down, feed costs were up, and the bank was starting to make threatening phone calls. Jake's father had died 2 years ago, leaving Jake to run the ranch alone. His mother had moved to town to live with his sister. Jake was barely keeping the ranch afloat. He made ends meet by traveling around the country, training problem horses for people who had more money than horse sense. It wasn't steady work, but it paid the bills. Usually, this month had been particularly slow, and Jake was behind on the ranch mortgage. When Robert Harrison offered to pay him $5,000 just to come look at a horse, Jake didn't hesitate. The drive from Texas to Montana gave Jake plenty of time to think. He wondered what kind of horse could cause so much trouble for a man with unlimited money. In his experience, most problem horses weren't really problems at all. They were just misunderstood. Horses that had been handled wrong, trained wrong, or treated badly. With patience and the right approach, most of them could be turned around, but occasionally Jake encountered a horse that was different. A horse with such a strong will and intelligence that traditional methods didn't work. These horses required something special. They needed someone who could think like they did, someone who could earn their respect rather than demand their submission. As Jake's truck rumbled through the ranch gates, he got his first look at the Harrison spread. It was impressive, that was for sure. Rolling green pastures stretched as far as the eye could see. Expensive fencing lined perfectly straight roads. Buildings that looked like they belonged in a magazine dotted the landscape. This was the kind of ranch that Jake had dreamed of owning someday, but Jake could also see signs of trouble. Several sections of fence had been recently repaired. In one pasture, there were scattered fence posts that looked like they had been hit by a tornado. A water trough sat upside down in the middle of a field. Whatever horse they were dealing with had been busy. Jake parked his dusty truck next to a shiny new SUV that probably cost more than Jake made in 2 years. He grabbed his worn cowboy hat from the passenger seat and settled it on his head. His boots crunched on the gravel as he walked toward the main house. The house was bigger than the church back in Jake's hometown. Glass and stone and wood all combined into something that belonged in a fancy magazine. Jake felt a little out of place in his faded jeans and work shirt, but he reminded himself that he wasn't here to impress anyone with his clothes. He was here to do a job that apparently no one else could do. Robert Harrison answered the door himself. He was younger than Jake had expected, probably in his early 40s. He looked like he spent more time in boardrooms than barns, but there was something genuine about his handshake. His grip was firm, and he looked Jake directly in the eyes. "You must be Jake Wilson," Robert said. "Thank you for making the drive. I know it's a long way from Texas." "Yes, sir, it is," Jake replied. "But you sounded like you needed help, and I don't turn my back on folks in trouble." Robert led Jake through the house to a wall of windows that overlooked the back pastures. Even from inside, they could hear the sound of splintering wood. Robert pointed toward a black shape moving through the far pasture. "There he is," Robert said. "Thunder. That's what the ranch hands call him. He came with the property, and he's been making my life miserable ever since." Jake studied the horse through the window. Even at a distance, he could see that this was no ordinary animal. Thunder moved with a grace and power that took Jake's breath away. The horse was magnificent. There was no doubt about that. But Jake could also see why he was causing problems. There was something in the way Thunder carried himself, a defiance that spoke of a spirit that had never been broken. "Tell me about him," Jake said, not taking his eyes off the horse. Robert launched into the whole story. The fence damage, the escaped cattle, the injured ranch hands, the trainers who had given up. As he talked, Jake watched Thunder. The horse seemed to sense that he was being observed. He stopped what he was doing and looked directly at the house, as if he could see through the walls to where Jake and Robert were standing. "How long has he been wild?" Jake asked. The previous owner said Thunder's been living free on this land for about 8 years. His mother was a ranch horse that escaped during a storm. She was already pregnant when she got loose. Thunder was born wild and has never been handled by humans. Jake nodded. That explained a lot. A horse that had never known human dominance would be much harder trained than one that had been handled and then turned wild. Thunder had no reference point for working with humans. To him, people were just another predator to be avoided or driven away. "Have you tried approaching him on foot?" Jake asked. Robert laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The last person who tried that ended up in the hospital. Thunder doesn't just run away from people. He actively tries to hurt them. It's like he sees humans as enemies." Jake continued to watch Thunder through the window. The horse was now standing perfectly still, his head raised high, ears forward. He was definitely aware that something was different. Horses had senses that people couldn't imagine. Thunder probably knew that Jake was there, even though they had never met. "What do you want me to do?" Jake asked. "I want you to train him," Robert said. "Make him rideable. Make him safe. I'll pay you whatever you ask." Jake was quiet for a long moment. He had handled difficult horses before, but something about Thunder was different. The horse wasn't just wild. He was intelligent wild. Jake could see it in the way Thunder moved, the way he seemed to plan his actions. This would be the biggest challenge of Jake's career. "I'll need to observe him for a few days before I make any decisions," Jake said finally. "And if I do take this on, I'll need complete control. No interference from you or your ranch hands. This horse doesn't trust humans, and having a crowd around will only make things worse." Robert nodded eagerly. "Whatever you need. There's a bunkhouse you can stay in. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean and comfortable." Jake smiled. After sleeping in his truck for the past 2 nights, a bunkhouse sounded like luxury. "That'll do just fine." As they shook hands on the deal, Thunder let out a loud whinny that echoed across the valley. It sounded almost like a challenge, as if the horse was announcing that he knew a new player had entered the game. Jake felt a familiar excitement building in his chest. This was why he did what he did. Not for the money, though he needed it badly. Not for the fame, because there wasn't much of that in horse training. He did it for moments like this, when he faced a challenge that seemed impossible. When he had the chance to connect with an animal that everyone else had given up on. Looking out at Thunder, Jake made a silent promise. He would find a way to reach this horse, no matter how long it took. Because somewhere under all that wildness and defiance, Jake believed there was a horse that just wanted to be understood. The real work was about to begin. Jake spent 3 full days just watching Thunder. He didn't try to approach the horse or even let Thunder see him up close. Instead, he positioned himself at different spots around the ranch, always staying downwind and out of sight. He watched Thunder eat, drink, sleep, and move around the property. Most importantly, he watched how Thunder thought. By the end of the 3rd day, Jake knew he was dealing with something special. Thunder wasn't just a wild horse. He was a genius wild horse. Jake had seen the horse solve problems that would stump most animals. When Thunder wanted water from a trough that was behind a locked gate, he didn't just give up. He studied the latch for 20 minutes, then figured out how to work it with his teeth and hooves. When ranch hands tried to corner him in a pasture, Thunder would circle around and escape through a gap in the fence. That was barely visible to human eyes, but Jake also noticed something else. Thunder was lonely. For all his intelligence and strength, he was completely alone. There were other horses on the ranch, but Thunder kept his distance from them. He had been living by himself for so long that he had forgotten how to be part of a herd. Jake recognized the signs because he felt the same loneliness himself. On the morning of the 4th day, Jake knocked on Robert's door. The millionaire answered wearing a silk robe and holding a cup of coffee that probably cost more than Jake spent on groceries in a month. "I've made my decision," Jake said without any small talk. "I'll work with Thunder, but I have conditions." Robert invited Jake inside and poured him a cup of coffee. They sat in Robert's massive kitchen, surrounded by appliances that Jake couldn't even identify. The contrast between their 2 worlds couldn't have been more obvious, but somehow they had found common ground in their shared Thunder problem. "What kind of conditions?" Robert asked. Jake took a sip of his coffee and looked Robert straight in the eye. "First, I work alone. No ranch hands watching, no suggestions from you, no interference of any kind. Thunder doesn't trust humans, and having a crowd around will set back any progress I might make." Robert nodded. That made sense. Second, I need at least 30 days. Maybe more. This isn't going to be a quick fix. Thunder has spent 8 years learning to survive without humans. It's going to take time to convince him that working with people might be better than working against them. 30 days is fine, Robert said. Take as long as you need. Jake set down his coffee cup and leaned back in his chair. What he was about to say would either get him thrown off the ranch or change his life forever. Third, I want half your ranch. Robert nearly choked on his coffee. He stared at Jake like the cowboy had just asked for the moon. I'm sorry, what did you say? You heard me right, Jake said calmly. If I can gentle Thunder enough to ride him and work cattle with him, I want half ownership of this ranch. Robert laughed out loud. Not a polite chuckle, but a full belly laugh that echoed through the kitchen. Jake, this ranch is worth over $8 million. You're asking for $4 million to train one horse. Jake didn't laugh. His expression remained completely serious. That's exactly what I'm asking for. That's insane, Robert said, still grinning. I could buy a dozen world champion horses for that kind of money. But you can't buy Thunder, Jake replied. And Thunder is the horse that's costing you $10,000 a day in damages. Thunder is the horse that's made your insurance company threaten to drop you. Thunder is the horse that's driven away your best ranch hands and made your wife afraid to visit her own property. Robert's smile faded as Jake's words sank in. The cowboy was right about the daily costs. Robert had done the math himself. At the current rate of destruction, Thunder would cost him over $3 million. In the next year alone. You're serious about this, aren't you? Robert asked. Dead serious, Jake said. I've watched that horse for 3 days and I know what I'm dealing with. This isn't just any training job. If I succeed, I'll have accomplished something that nobody else in the world could do. That kind of success is worth half a ranch. Robert stood up and walked to the window. Thunder was visible in the distance, standing like a black statue against the green pasture. The horse seemed to be looking directly at the house, as if he knew his fate was being decided. And if you fail? Robert asked. If I fail, I walk away with nothing. You don't owe me a penny. I'll even pay for my own food and lodging while I'm here. Robert turned back to face Jake. You're betting 30 days of your life against $4 million worth of ranch land. That's about the size of it, Jake said. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an expensive grandfather clock in the corner. Robert's business mind was working overtime, calculating risks and rewards. On one hand, Jake's demand seemed absolutely ridiculous. On the other hand, Robert was desperate. He had already spent more money on Thunder than most people made in a lifetime, and the horse was still as wild as ever. Why? Robert asked finally. Why are you willing to take such a crazy risk? Jake was quiet for a moment, trying to find the right words. Because I'm about to lose my family's ranch in Texas. The bank is going to foreclose in 6 months. I've tried everything I can think of to save it, but I'm running out of time and money. This might be my only chance to keep the Wilson name on ranch land. Robert studied Jake's face and saw the pain behind his calm exterior. Here was a man who was fighting to save everything his family had built, just like Robert was fighting to make his ranch investment work. You really think you can train Thunder? Robert asked. I don't know, Jake said honestly. But I know I can try harder than anyone else because I have more to lose. For you, Thunder is a business problem. For me, he's the difference between keeping my family legacy alive or watching it die. Robert walked back to the table and sat down across from Jake. He had built his fortune by taking calculated risks, but this was beyond calculation. This was pure gut instinct. If you succeed, you'll own half of everything. The land, the cattle, the buildings, all of it. And half the debt and expenses too, Jake added. I'm not looking for a free ride. I want to be a real partner. Robert extended his hand across the table. You've got yourself a deal, cowboy. Jake shook Robert's hand, sealing the most important agreement of his life. In 30 days he would either be a multi-millionaire ranch owner or a broke cowboy heading back to Texas with nothing but his truck and his pride. As they shook hands, Thunder's whinny echoed across the valley. It sounded different this time, less like a challenge and more like a question. As if the horse was asking what came next. Robert called his layer that afternoon to draw up the papers. The lawyer, a serious man in an expensive suit, thought both. Robert and Jake had lost their minds. He spent an hour trying to talk Robert out of the deal. "This is the most ridiculous contract I've ever written," the lawyer said as he prepared the documents. "You're essentially betting $4 million on a cowboy's ability to tame a wild horse." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Robert replied. Though he wasn't entirely sure that was true, the contract was simple but ironclad. If Jake could ride Thunder and demonstrate that the horse could work cattle within 30 days, he would receive half ownership of the ranch. If he failed, he would leave with nothing. Jake signed the papers with a steady hand, but his heart was pounding. He had just bet everything on his ability to connect with an animal that had spent its entire life avoiding human contact. That night, Jake lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling. Through the open window, he could hear Thunder moving around in the distance, the sound of hoofbeats on hard ground. Occasionally, the soft snort of a horse breathing in the cool mountain air. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Jake had 30 days to accomplish the impossible. 30 days to bridge the gap between human and horse. 30 days to save both. His dreams and Robert's investment. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind kept racing. In a few hours, he would step into the pasture with Thunder for the first time. He had no idea how the horse would react. Thunder might run away, or he might attack. Either way, Jake's life was about to change forever. The biggest gamble of his life was about to begin. Jake woke up before dawn on his first official day with Thunder. He had barely slept, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. Through his bunkhouse window, he could see the first hints of light creeping over the mountains. Somewhere out there, Thunder was probably already awake too. Horses were early risers by nature. Jake made himself a simple breakfast of coffee and toast. He had learned long ago that working with difficult horses required patience, and patience required fuel. He ate slowly, thinking through his approach. Every horse was different, but Thunder was unlike any horse he had ever encountered. This would require a completely new strategy. Most horse trainers believed in establishing dominance early. They would use ropes, round pens, and pressure to show the horse who was boss. But Jake knew that approach would never work with Thunder. This horse had spent 8 years proving that no human could dominate him. Trying to force the issue would only make Thunder more determined to resist. Instead, Jake planned to use what his grandfather had called the old way. It was a method that took longer, but created a deeper bond between horse and human. The idea was simple. Instead of trying to break the horse's spirit, you earned the horse's respect and trust. You became partners instead of master and servant. As the sun climbed higher, Jake gathered his tools. But unlike most trainers, Jake's tools were simple. He had a bucket of oats, a few apples, a length of soft rope, and most importantly, time. He didn't bring whips or spurs or any of the aggressive tools that other trainers relied on. Those would only convince Thunder that humans were enemies. Jake walked slowly toward the pasture where Thunder spent most of his time. It was a large field, maybe 20 acres, surrounded by strong fencing. There was a small shed in one corner, where Thunder could take shelter from bad weather. A creek ran along one side, providing fresh water. It was actually a pretty good setup for a wild horse. As Jake approached the gate, he could see Thunder standing about 100 yards away. The horse's head was raised high, ears forward, every muscle tense and ready for action. Thunder had obviously heard Jake coming and was prepared for whatever might happen next. Jake opened the gate slowly and stepped into the pasture. Thunder immediately moved further away, maintaining the distance between them. Jake didn't try to approach the horse. Instead, he walked to a spot about 50 yards from where Thunder was standing and sat down on the ground. This was the hardest part for most people to understand. Sitting still and doing nothing didn't look like horse training. But Jake knew that the first step in earning Thunder's trust was to show that he wasn't a threat. Predators moved quickly and aggressively. Friends moved slowly and calmly. Jake sat in the grass for 2 hours without moving toward Thunder. He didn't even look directly at the horse. Instead, he watched the clouds, listened to the birds, and occasionally talked softly to himself. 2. Anyone watching it would have looked like Jake was just enjoying a peaceful morning in the pasture, but Thunder was watching every move. Jake could feel the horse's eyes on him, studying him, trying to figure out what kind of threat he represented. Horses were prey animals, which meant they were naturally suspicious of anything new or different. Thunder had extra reason to be cautious because humans had been trying to catch him for months. After about an hour, Thunder's posture began to relax slightly. His head lowered a few inches and his ears weren't quite as rigid. He was still watchful, but he was starting to accept that Jake might not be planning to attack him. Jake pulled an apple from his pocket and took a bite. The sound carried clearly across the pasture, and Thunder's ears perked up with interest. Apples weren't part of Thunder's natural diet, but most horses loved them. Jake ate about half the apple, then tossed the rest onto the ground between himself. And Thunder stared at the apple for a long time. Jake could almost see the horse's mind working. Was this a trap? Was the human trying to trick him into coming closer? Thunder had probably never been offered food by a human before. He didn't know what to make of this strange behavior. Finally, Thunder's curiosity overcame his caution. He took a few careful steps toward the apple, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. When Jake didn't move, Thunder took a few more steps. It took him nearly 20 minutes to work up the courage to actually approach the apple. When Thunder finally reached the apple, he sniffed it carefully before taking a tentative bite. His eyes never left Jake, and he was positioned so he could run away instantly if needed. But Jake remained perfectly still, showing no interest in the horse at all. Thunder finished the apple and returned to his original position. But something had changed. He had taken food from near a human and nothing bad had happened. It was a small step, but it was the beginning of trust. Jake repeated this routine for the next 5 days. Every morning he would enter the pasture and sit in the same spot. He would eat an apple and share it with Thunder. Gradually, Thunder began to approach more quickly and with less fear. By the end of the first week, Thunder would eat the apple while Jake was still sitting nearby. On the 8th day, Jake tried something different. Instead of throwing the apple, he held it out in his hand. Thunder approached as usual, but stopped when he saw that Jake was holding the food. For a long moment, horse and man stared at each other across 10 feet of grass. Thunder stretched his neck forward, trying to reach the apple without getting too close to Jake, but Jake's arm wasn't quite long enough. If Thunder wanted the apple, he would have to take another step closer. Jake could see the conflict in Thunder's eyes. The horse wanted the apple, but every instinct told him to stay away from the human. For several minutes, Thunder shifted his weight back and forth, unable to decide what to do. Finally, Thunder took one small step forward, then another, and another, until he was close enough to take the apple directly from Jake's hand. The moment Thunder's lips touched Jake's palm was electric. For the first time in his life, Thunder was voluntarily making physical contact with a human. It was brief, just a few seconds while he grabbed the apple and stepped back. But it was a breakthrough that made Jake's heart race with excitement. Robert had been watching from a distance, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The horse that had terrorized his ranch for months was eating from Jake's hand like a gentle pony. When Robert told his ranch foreman Bill about it, the old cowboy just shook his head in disbelief. Over the next week, Jake continued to build on this foundation of trust. Each day, Thunder would come a little closer and stay a little longer. Jake began talking to the horse in a low, steady voice. He didn't expect Thunder to understand the words, but horses were very sensitive to tone of voice. A calm, friendly tone told Thunder that Jake was relaxed and peaceful. "Good morning, Thunder," Jake would say as the horse approached for his daily apple. "Beautiful day, isn't it? Look at those clouds rolling over the mountains. Bet you've seen a lot of weather from this pasture." Thunder began to associate Jake's voice with good things like food and gentle treatment. The horse's ears would perk. up with interest when Jake spoke, and sometimes Thunder would even make soft, nickering sounds in response. By the end of the second week, Thunder was allowing Jake to stand while feeding him apples. The horse was still ready to run at any moment, but he was no longer automatically afraid when Jake moved. Jake knew he was making progress, but he also knew the hardest part was still ahead. Getting Thunder to accept food was one thing. Getting him to accept touch was something completely different. Horses in the wild only touched each other when they were grooming friends or fighting enemies. Jake had to convince Thunder that human touch could be a third option, the touch of a partner. On day 15, Jake decided to try something that would either advance their relationship or destroy all the trust they had built. After Thunder finished his apple, Jake slowly extended his hand toward the horse's neck. Thunder's eyes widened with alarm. He had accepted food from this human, but allowing touch was a much bigger step. Touch meant vulnerability. Touch meant giving up the ability to run away instantly. Jake moved his hand very slowly, talking softly the entire time. Easy, boy. Nobody's going to hurt you. We're just going to be friends, you and me. Thunder stood frozen as Jake's hand came closer. Every muscle in the horse's body was coiled like a spring, ready to explode into action. Jake could feel the tension radiating from Thunder like heat from a fire when Jake's fingers finally made contact with Thunder's neck. The horse shuddered but didn't run. Jake let his hand rest there for just a moment before pulling it away. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Thunder had allowed a human to touch him voluntarily for the first time. In his life, Jake stepped back and smiled. Good boy, Thunder. That wasn't so bad, was it? Thunder snorted and shook his head, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened, but he didn't run away. Instead, he stood there looking at Jake with what almost seemed like curiosity. The dance between human and horse was just beginning, but Jake felt hopeful for the first time since arriving at the ranch. Thunder was starting to trust him. Now the real work could begin. By day 18, Jake and Thunder had developed something that looked almost like friendship. Every morning, Thunder would wait by the fence for Jake to arrive. The horse would nicker softly when he saw the cowboy approaching, a sound that meant recognition and welcome. Jake could now touch Thunder's neck and shoulders without the horse flinching away. They had even progressed to the point where Jake could run his hands along Thunder's sides and back to anyone watching. It looked like a miracle. The horse that had been impossible to approach was now seeking out human contact. Robert watched from his office window every morning, amazed by the transformation he was witnessing. His wife had even started visiting the ranch again, curious to see the progress for herself, but Jake knew they were still a long way from the goal. Allowing touch was one thing. Accepting a saddle and rider was something completely different. That would require Thunder to trust Jake with his life. And trust like that couldn't be rushed. Jake had been working on getting Thunder comfortable with equipment. He started by simply carrying a rope into the pasture and letting it drag on the ground while he and Thunder went through their usual routine. At first, Thunder was suspicious of the rope, snorting and dancing away from it. But after a few days, he learned to ignore it. Next, Jake introduced a soft halter. He would hold it while feeding Thunder apples, letting the horse get used to the sight and smell of leather. Gradually, Thunder stopped seeing the halter as a threat. Jake even managed to slip it over Thunder's head a few times, though he always removed it immediately. The idea was to get Thunder used to wearing equipment without making him feel trapped. The weather had been perfect for the past 2 weeks. Clear skies, gentle breezes, comfortable temperatures. It was the kind of weather that made working outside a pleasure. But on the morning of day 18, Jake woke to the sound of thunder rumbling in the distance. He looked out his bunkhouse window and saw dark clouds building over the mountains. The air felt heavy and electric, the way it did before a big storm. Jake had lived in ranch country his whole life, and he knew this was going to be more than just a little rain. Jake considered staying inside until the storm passed, but he didn't want to break the routine he had established with Thunder. The horse would be expecting him, and Jake had learned that consistency was crucial when building trust. He put on his rain jacket and headed for the pasture. Thunder was waiting by the fence as usual, but Jake could see that the horse was nervous. Thunder's ears were constantly moving, tracking sounds that Jake couldn't hear. His nostrils flared as he tested the air for scents carried on the changing wind. Horses were much more sensitive to weather changes than humans, and Thunder could feel the approaching storm in ways that Jake could only imagine. "Easy, boy," Jake said as he entered the pasture. "Just a little weather coming our way. Nothing we can't handle." But as Jake approached with Thunder's morning apple, the first flash of lightning split the sky. It was still far away, but the crack of thunder that followed made Thunder jump and snort with alarm. Wild horses had good reason to fear storms. Lightning could kill, and high winds could bring down trees. Thunder's instincts told him to find shelter or run to higher ground. Jake tried to continue their normal routine, but Thunder was too agitated to focus on food. The horse kept looking toward the mountains where the storm was building. His body language screamed of barely controlled panic. Jake had seen this before in wild horses, and he knew it could be dangerous. Another lightning flash, closer this time, lit up the darkening sky. The thunder that followed was loud enough to make Jake flinch. Thunder reared up on his hind legs, his front hooves pawing the air. When he came down, he was facing away from Jake, ready to run. "Whoa, Thunder," Jake said, trying to keep his voice calm and soothing. "It's okay, boy, just a storm. We've both seen storms before." But Thunder wasn't listening. His eyes had gone wide with fear, showing white around the edges. His breathing was rapid and shallow. 8 years of living wild had taught him that storms were serious business, and every instinct in his body was telling him to get as far away from this place as possible. Jake made a crucial mistake. Instead of backing away and giving Thunder space to calm down, he stepped forward with his hand extended. He was trying to offer comfort through touch, the way he had been doing for the past week. But to Thunder, in his panicked state, Jake's approach felt like a threat. Thunder spun around to face Jake, his ears pinned back against his head. For a split second, Jake saw something in the horse's eyes that he had never seen before during their time together. Fear had transformed into aggression. Thunder wasn't seeing Jake as his friend anymore. He was seeing him as just another threat to be dealt with. Thunder reared up again, but this time he was directly in front of Jake. The cowboy tried to step backward, but his foot slipped on the wet grass. As Thunder came down, his right front hoof caught Jake squarely in the chest. The impact was like being hit by a sledgehammer. Jake felt his ribs crack as he was thrown backward through the air. He hit the ground hard and rolled several times before coming to a stop against the pasture fence. Pain exploded through his chest with every breath. Thunder stood over Jake for a moment, snorting and pawing the ground. The horse seemed as surprised by what had happened as Jake was. But the storm was getting closer, and Thunder's fear overcame any concern he might have felt for the human. He turned and galloped toward the far end of the pasture, seeking shelter in the trees. Jake lay on the ground, struggling to breathe. Each breath felt like knives stabbing into his chest. He knew immediately that he was seriously hurt. The taste of blood in his mouth told him that the damage was internal as well as external. Rain began to fall as Jake tried to get to his feet. The first few drops quickly became a downpour. Lightning flashed overhead, followed immediately by deafening thunder. The storm that had spooked Thunder was now directly overhead. Jake managed to crawl to the fence and pull himself upright. Every movement sent waves of agony through his chest and abdomen. He could see Thunder in the distance, standing under a cluster of trees, his head lowered against the driving rain. The horse looked smaller somehow, less magnificent than before. Fear had reduced him back to what he really was, a wild animal following his survival instincts. Robert appeared at the fence, having seen the incident from his office window. His face was pale with concern as he saw Jake struggling to stand. "Don't try to move," Robert shouted over the storm. "I'm calling an ambulance." Jake wanted to protest, but he didn't have the breath for words. Robert helped him through the fence and into his truck. The ride to the hospital was a blur of pain and rain and flashing lights. At the hospital, X-rays revealed 3 broken ribs and internal bruising. The doctor, a serious woman with kind eyes, explained that Jake was lucky. A few inches higher and Thunder's hoof might have crushed his skull. A few inches lower and it might have ruptured internal organs. You need to stay here for at least 3 days, the doctor said. Those ribs need time to start healing, and we need to monitor you for signs of internal bleeding. Jake shook his head, wincing at the pain the movement caused. I can't stay here for 3 days. I have work to do, the doctor frowned. What kind of work is more important than your health? Robert, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, spoke up. He's trying to train a wild horse. He only has 12 days left to finish the job. The doctor looked at Jake like he had lost his mind. You want to go back to working with the horse that just put you in the hospital? It wasn't Thunder's fault, Jake said. I pushed too hard too fast. He was scared, and I didn't give him enough space. That's on me, not him. Robert couldn't believe what he was hearing. Jake, that horse could have killed you. Maybe we should just call this whole thing off. No, Jake said firmly, then gasped as the word sent pain shooting through his chest. We made a deal, and I intend to keep it. Thunder just reminded me that he's still a wild horse. I won't make that mistake again. The ranch foreman, Bill, had driven to the hospital as soon as he heard what happened. He stood in the doorway shaking his head. Boy, I've been working with horses for 40 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened today. That horse is dangerous. He's always been dangerous, but today he proved it. Jake looked at the 3 men standing around his hospital bed. He could see the doubt in their eyes. They all thought he should give up, walk away while he could still walk. And maybe they were right. Maybe Thunder really was too wild to ever be trained, but as Jake lay there in pain, he thought about Thunder standing alone in the rain. The horse had been making such good progress, learning to trust, learning to connect with a human for the first time in his life. The storm had triggered something primal in Thunder, something that went beyond the trust they had been building. Jake understood that feeling. He had felt the same primitive fear when the bank threatened to foreclose on his family ranch. Fear made you do things you wouldn't normally do. It made you lash out at people who were trying to help. Thunder's attack wasn't personal. It was survival. I'm going back to work tomorrow, Jake announced. The hell you are, Robert said. You can barely sit up. Jake woke up the next morning feeling like he had been run over by a truck. Every muscle in his body ached, and his broken ribs sent sharp pains through his chest with each breath. The doctor had given him pain medication, but Jake had barely touched it. He needed to stay alert and focused for what was about to happen. Walking to the pasture took twice as long as usual. Jake had to stop every few steps to catch his breath and let the pain subside. Robert had offered to drive him, but Jake insisted on walking. He needed Thunder to see that he was coming on his own, under his own power. As Jake approached the fence, he could see Thunder standing in the exact spot where the accident had happened. The horse's head was raised high, and his ears were pointed toward the approaching human. Jake couldn't tell if Thunder was curious, worried, or preparing to run. Away. Jake opened the gate slowly and stepped into the pasture. Thunder immediately moved away, putting about 50 yards between them. It was the same distance Thunder had maintained during their very first day together. All the progress they had made seemed to have vanished overnight. Jake wasn't surprised. In Thunder's mind, their relationship had been tested by yesterday's storm, and both of them had failed the test. Jake had pushed too hard when Thunder was scared, and Thunder had hurt the human who had been trying to help him. Now they had to start over and rebuild the trust they had lost. Jake walked to his usual spot and sat down carefully. The movement sent waves of pain through his chest, but he managed not to show it. Horses were incredibly good at reading body language, and Jake didn't want Thunder to sense his weakness. Not because he was afraid Thunder would attack again, but because he needed the horse to see him as a strong, reliable partner. For the first hour, Thunder stayed at a distance. He watched Jake constantly, but he didn't approach. Jake could see the conflict in the horse's eyes. Part of Thunder wanted to come closer, to return to the comfortable routine they had established. But another part of him remembered the fear and confusion of yesterday's storm and the violence that had followed. Jake pulled an apple from his pocket and took a bite. The familiar sound carried across the pasture, and Thunder's ears perked up with interest. But unlike before, Thunder didn't move toward the sound. He remained frozen in place, torn between desire and caution. Jake finished half the apple and tossed the rest onto the ground between himself and Thunder. Then he sat back and waited. This was the test that would determine whether their relationship could survive what had happened. For 20 minutes, Thunder stared at the apple without moving. Jake could almost see the horse's mind working through the problem. He wanted the apple, but getting it would mean approaching the human who had been there when everything went wrong yesterday. Finally, Thunder took one tentative step forward. Then he stopped and looked at Jake, as if asking permission to continue. Jake remained perfectly still, showing no reaction to Thunder's movement. Slowly, carefully, Thunder began to approach the apple, but this time was different from before. Thunder's approach was hesitant and nervous. He would take a few steps, stop and evaluate, then take a few more steps. It took him nearly 30 minutes to cover the ground that he used to cross in just a few seconds. When Thunder finally reached the apple, he didn't eat it right away. Instead, he sniffed it carefully, then looked at Jake for a long moment. Jake felt like the horse was trying to communicate something, but he wasn't sure what. Thunder picked up the apple and backed away a few steps before eating it. The message was clear. Thunder still wanted the food and the connection it represented, but he wasn't ready to trust completely. Not yet. Jake spent the next 3 days rebuilding their relationship from scratch. Each morning, Thunder would approach a little more confidently. By the 4th day after the accident, Thunder was again taking apples directly from Jake's hand. But there was still a wariness in the horse's eyes that hadn't been there before. On the 5th day, Jake decided to try something that would either restore their bond or prove that it was permanently damaged. Instead of offering Thunder an apple, Jake simply held out his empty hand. No food, no reward, just an invitation for contact. Thunder looked at Jake's outstretched hand for a long time. The horse understood what was being offered. This wasn't about food anymore. This was about forgiveness and trust. Jake was asking Thunder to make physical contact simply because they were friends, not because there was something in it for the horse. Slowly, Thunder stretched his neck forward and touched Jake's hand with his nose. It was the gentlest possible contact, barely more than a whisper of touch, but it was enough. Thunder was saying that he was ready to try again. Over the next few days, Jake began reintroducing the equipment that Thunder had been learning to accept. The soft rope, the halter, the saddle blanket. Thunder was more cautious than before, but he didn't panic. He seemed to understand that the accident had been a one-time event, not a pattern. On day 26, Jake achieved something that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. He managed to place a saddle on Thunder's back and secure it with a girth. Thunder stood still during the entire process, though every muscle in his body was tense with concentration. Jake led Thunder around the pasture with the saddle on, letting the horse get used to the feeling of carrying weight. Thunder moved carefully, testing each step to make sure the saddle wasn't going to hurt him. But he didn't try to buck it off or roll to get rid of it. He was learning to trust Jake's judgment about what was safe and what wasn't. Robert watched the entire process from his office window, hardly daring to breathe. He had never seen anything like what Jake was accomplishing. The horse that had been impossible to approach was now wearing a saddle and walking calmly beside a human. On day 27, Jake decided it was time for the biggest test of all. He had been building up to this moment for nearly a month, and everything depended on how Thunder reacted to having a human on his back. Jake approached Thunder with the saddle, and the horse stood still while Jake secured it in place. Then Jake led Thunder to a mounting block that he had positioned in the center of the pasture. Thunder had seen the block for several days now, so it wasn't a surprise. Jake climbed onto the mounting block slowly, talking softly to Thunder the entire time. "Easy, boy. We're going to try something new today. Nothing scary, just a new way for us to be together." Thunder's ears swiveled back and forth, tracking Jake's voice and movement. The horse was nervous, but he wasn't panicked. Jake could feel the tension in Thunder's body, but it was the tension of concentration, not fear. Jake placed his hand on the saddle and applied gentle pressure, simulating the weight of a rider. Thunder shifted slightly but didn't move away. Jake increased the pressure gradually, letting Thunder get used to the idea of carrying weight on his back. Finally, Jake swung his leg over the saddle and settled gently into place. For a moment, both horse and rider were perfectly still. Thunder seemed to be processing this new sensation, trying to decide how he felt about having a human on his back. Jake could feel Thunder's power beneath him. Oh, that strength and wildness contained in one magnificent animal. He could also feel Thunder's intelligence, the careful way the horse was evaluating this new situation. This wasn't just a physical test. It was a mental and emotional challenge for both of them. Thunder took one careful step forward, then another. Jake could feel the horse's uncertainty in every movement, but he could also feel Thunder's determination to try. They walked slowly around the pasture, horse and rider learning to move together. After about 10 minutes, Jake dismounted and immediately gave Thunder his favorite treat. The horse had passed the biggest test of their relationship. Thunder had carried a human rider willingly, without being forced or broken. Robert couldn't contain his excitement any longer. He ran out to the pasture, grinning from ear to ear. "Jake, that was incredible. I can't believe what I just saw." But Jake remained calm. He knew that riding Thunder once was just the beginning. The real test would come tomorrow, when they had to prove that Thunder could do more than just carry a rider. He had to prove that Thunder could work. "Tomorrow's the real test," Jake told Robert. "Anyone can sit on a horse. But can Thunder and I work together as a team? That's what we need to find out." Jake spent the evening preparing for the final challenge. In just 2 days, his 30-day deadline would be up. He had managed to ride Thunder, which was more than anyone thought possible. But according to their agreement, Thunder also had to be able to work cattle. That would require a level of partnership that went far beyond simply accepting a rider. As Jake settled into his bunk that night, he felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Tomorrow would determine whether the past month had been a success or a failure. Tomorrow would decide whether Jake became a ranch owner or returned to Texas with nothing but his truck and his memories. Through his window, Jake could see Thunder standing quietly in the moonlight. The horse looked peaceful, no longer the wild, dangerous animal that Jake had first encountered. But looks could be deceiving. Tomorrow's test would reveal whether Thunder's transformation was complete, or whether there were still depths of wildness that Jake hadn't been able to reach. The final challenge was about to begin. Day 29 dawned clear and cool, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of mountain wildflowers across the ranch. Jake had barely slept, his mind racing through everything that could go wrong in the next few hours. Today wasn't just about proving that Thunder could work cattle. It was about proving that their partnership was real and lasting. Robert had decided that if Thunder was going to be tested, it should be done properly. He had asked Bill, the ranch foreman, to select the most challenging cattle on the property. These weren't gentle, cooperative animals. They were the stubborn bulls and difficult cows that even the most experienced ranch horses struggled to handle. "If that horse can work these cattle," Bill had told Robert, "then he can work any cattle. These are the ones that have been giving us trouble all year." Jake understood the significance of the test. It would have been easy for Robert to choose docile cattle that any horse could handle. Instead, he was offering Jake and Thunder the chance to prove themselves against the toughest challenge the ranch could provide. Jake saddled Thunder with extra care that morning, checking every strap and buckle twice. The horse stood patiently during the process, but Jake could sense an alertness in Thunder that hadn't been there during their practice sessions. Somehow, Thunder seemed to know that today was different, that this was the day that would determine his future. "Ready for this, boy?" Jake asked softly as he adjusted the saddle one final time. "Today we find out what we're really made of." Thunder turned his head to look at Jake, and for a moment their eyes met. Jake saw intelligence there, and determination, and something else that surprised him: excitement. Thunder wasn't nervous about the test ahead. He was eager for it. The cattle were waiting in a large pasture about a quarter-mile from the main ranch buildings. As Jake and Thunder approached, Jake could see why Bill had chosen these particular animals. They were big, stubborn-looking bulls and cows that had clearly never met a human they respected. Some of them had horns that looked like they could punch holes in a truck, Robert. Bill and 3 other ranch hands were positioned around the perimeter of the pasture, ready to help if things went wrong. But according to the terms of Jake's agreement, he and Thunder had to do the actual work alone. The other men were there only for safety. "The job is simple," Robert called out to Jake. "Separate the 5 bulls from the herd and move them to the holding pen on the other side of the pasture. If Thunder can do that, he's proven himself as a working horse." Jake nodded and guided Thunder toward the herd. As they approached, the cattle looked up from their grazing and watched with suspicious eyes. Cattle had an instinctive fear of horses, especially horses they didn't know. These animals had probably never seen Thunder before, and they weren't sure what to make of him. The first challenge came immediately. The cattle didn't want to be approached at all, let alone separated and moved. As soon as Jake and Thunder got within 50 yards, the entire herd began moving away from them. The bulls, being the most stubborn, positioned themselves at the back of the group and refused to budge. This was where Thunder's intelligence began to show. Instead of charging straight at the cattle like an inexperienced horse might do, Thunder studied the situation carefully. Jake could feel the horse thinking beneath him, analyzing the problem like a chess player planning his next move. Thunder began to circle the herd slowly, keeping just enough pressure on them to make them nervous without causing them to panic and scatter. Jake had to admire the horse's instincts. Thunder had never worked cattle before, but he seemed to understand intuitively how to control their movement. The real test came when Jake tried to separate the first bull from the herd. Bulls were territorial animals that didn't like being singled out. This particular bull was a massive black Angus that probably weighed twice as much as Thunder. He had no intention of cooperating with anyone's plans. Jake guided Thunder closer to the bull, trying to position them so they could cut the animal away from the herd. The bull immediately charged toward Thunder, his head lowered and his eyes blazing with anger. It was exactly the kind of situation that could end badly for both horse and rider, but Thunder didn't panic. As the bull charged, Thunder sidestepped, with the grace of a dancer, avoiding the bull's rush while maintaining his position. The horse's movement was so smooth that Jake barely felt it. It was like riding a wave instead of an animal. The bull, frustrated by Thunder's evasive maneuver, turned and charged again. This time, Thunder was ready. As the bull approached, Thunder spun to the left, then immediately cut back to the right, confusing the bull and positioning himself perfectly to drive the animal away from the herd. Jake was amazed by what he was feeling. Thunder wasn't just following his commands. The horse was thinking independently, anticipating the bull's moves and responding faster than any human could react. It was like having a conversation in a language that didn't require words. Working together, Jake and Thunder managed to separate the first bull and drive him toward the holding pen. The bull tried several times to return to the herd, but Thunder was always there to block his path. Every move the bull made, Thunder had already anticipated. The second and third bulls were easier. Thunder had figured out the game now, and he seemed to be enjoying it. Jake could feel the horse's excitement building with each successful maneuver. Thunder was discovering that he had skills he didn't even know he possessed, but the fourth bull presented a new challenge. This was an older animal, craftier, and more experienced than the others. He had probably been through this process many times before, and he had learned how to make life difficult for cowboys and horses. The bull refused to be separated from the herd. Every time Thunder tried to cut him out, the bull would duck back into the group or position himself behind the other cattle. It was like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. Jake could feel Thunder's frustration growing. The horse was used to succeeding, and this bull was making him look foolish. But Jake also sensed something else in Thunder: determination. The horse wasn't going to give up just because the job was difficult. Thunder changed his strategy. Instead of trying to force the bull to move, he began to work on the other cattle, gradually shifting the position of the entire herd. It was a brilliant tactic that Jake hadn't expected. Thunder was using the bull's stubbornness against him. As the herd shifted, the bull found himself isolated at the edge of the group. Thunder immediately seized the opportunity, cutting between the bull and the other cattle before the animal could react. The bull tried to rejoin the herd, but Thunder was everywhere at once, blocking every escape route. Finally, the bull gave up and allowed himself to be driven toward the holding pen. Jake could feel Thunder's satisfaction as they accomplished what had seemed impossible just minutes before. The fifth bull was the biggest and meanest of them all. He was a massive red animal with scars on his hide that told stories of previous battles. His horns were sharp and dangerous, and his eyes held the kind of intelligence that made him truly formidable. As Jake and Thunder approached, the bull lowered his head and pawed the ground, sending up clouds of dust. He was issuing a challenge, daring them to try to move him. Thunder accepted the challenge. Jake felt the horse's muscles tense beneath him as Thunder prepared for what he knew would be the toughest test of the day. This wasn't just about moving cattle anymore. This was about respect and dominance and proving who belonged on this ranch. The bull charged with the force of a freight train, but Thunder was ready. At the last possible moment, Thunder spun away from the bull's rush, then immediately spun back to cut off the animal's escape route. It was a move that required perfect timing and incredible athleticism. The bull tried again, and again Thunder evaded him while maintaining control of the situation. Jake realized that he was witnessing something extraordinary. Thunder wasn't just working cattle. He was engaged in a battle of wills with an opponent that matched his own intelligence and determination. The contest went on for 10 minutes, with neither horse nor bull giving ground. But gradually, Thunder began to gain the advantage. His movements were more economical, more precise. He was learning the bull's patterns and using that knowledge against him. Finally, the bull seemed to realize that he was beaten. His charges became less aggressive, his movements less determined. Thunder had won the psychological battle, and the physical victory followed quickly after. Jake guided Thunder as they drove the defeated bull toward the holding pen. The animal went reluctantly, but he went. As the gate closed behind the fifth bull, a cheer went up from the ranch hands who had been watching the entire performance. Robert walked over to where Jake sat on Thunder, his face glowing with amazement and pride. "Jake, I've been around horses my whole life, and I've never seen anything like what just happened. That horse of yours isn't just trained, he's gifted." Jake dismounted and immediately gave Thunder the biggest apple he could find. The horse had earned it and much more. In one morning, Thunder had proven that he could do the work of the best ranch horses in the country. More importantly, he had proven that the partnership between horse and human could accomplish things that neither could achieve alone. As Jake looked around at the faces of the men who had witnessed, the morning of day 30 arrived with golden sunlight streaming across the Montana mountains. Jake woke up feeling different than he had in years. For the first time since his father died, he wasn't worried about losing everything his family had built. Today, he would become a landowner again, a partner in one of the most beautiful ranches in the state. Jake walked to the pasture for what he thought might be the last time as a hired hand. Tomorrow, he would be walking these same paths as an owner. But first, he wanted to spend a quiet moment with Thunder, the horse who had changed both their lives. Thunder was waiting by the fence, as he had been every morning for the past month. But something was different about the horse today. There was a calmness in his eyes that Jake had never seen before. Thunder looked content, settled, like he had finally found where he belonged. "Good morning, partner," Jake said softly as he approached Thunder with an apple. "Ready for your new life?" Thunder took the apple gently from Jake's hand, then pressed his forehead against Jake's chest. It was a gesture of affection that horses reserve for their closest friends. Jake felt a lump form in his throat as he realized how far they had both come. Robert arrived at the pasture an hour later, carrying a briefcase full of legal documents. His lawyer was with him, looking slightly ridiculous in his expensive suit and city shoes as he tried to navigate the muddy ground around the fence. "Well, Jake," Robert said with a grin, "are you ready to become a ranch owner?" Jake nodded, though part of him still couldn't quite believe this was really happening. Month ago, he had been a broke cowboy driving an old truck across the country for a job that seemed impossible. Now he was about to own half of an $8 million ranch. The paperwork took almost an hour to complete. Jake signed document after document, transferring ownership of land, cattle, equipment, and buildings. When it was finished, Jake Wilson was officially the co-owner of Harrison Ranch. "Congratulations, partner," Robert said, shaking Jake's hand. "Now the real work begins." Robert was right about that. Owning a ranch was very different from just working on one. Jake would now be responsible for making decisions about everything from cattle breeding to equipment purchases. He would have to learn about business matters that he had never dealt with before, but Jake wasn't worried about the challenges ahead. He had learned something important during his month with Thunder. The most difficult problems could be solved if you approached them with patience, understanding, and respect. The same principles that worked with horses would work with business. Over the next few weeks, Jake and Robert developed an efficient partnership. Robert handled the financial and business side of the operation, while Jake took care of the day-to-day ranch work. They made decisions together, combining Robert's business experience with Jake's practical knowledge of ranching. Thunder became the foundation of their new horse breeding program. Word spread quickly through the ranching community about the black stallion who had gone from wild and dangerous to brilliant and reliable in just 30 days. Other ranch owners wanted to breed their mares to Thunder, hoping to produce foals with his intelligence and athleticism. Jake was careful to manage Thunder's new responsibilities. The horse was no longer wild, but he was still special. Jake made sure that Thunder had plenty of time to run free in the pastures, to remember what it felt like to be wild and independent. That wildness was part of what made Thunder so extraordinary, and Jake never wanted him to lose it completely. Thunder's offspring proved to be remarkable horses. They inherited their father's intelligence and spirit, but they were born into human hands and grew up comfortable with people. These foals had the best of both worlds: the wild horse's natural instincts and the domestic horse's willingness to work with humans. Within 2 years, Harrison Ranch had developed